The night opens over an ocean of silver. Endless waves shimmering under the pale light of a tired moon. You can almost hear the creak of wood, the whisper of sails, the heartbeat of a small kingdom daring to face the unknown. This is the story of discovery and desire, of faith and fire, of a people so small in land, yet so infinite in ambition. It is the tale of how Portugal, pressed against the edge of Europe, stepped into the wind and changed the course of the world. Imagine it. The year is 1415. The scent of salt and smoke fills the air. Men carve maps by candlelight while the sea murmurs secrets beyond the horizon. They don't yet know it, but the ocean will make them and unmake them. What would you have felt, standing there on the cliffs of Sagres, watching the last light fade as the first ships vanished into black water? Would you have turned back to safety, or followed the sound of the wind calling your name? Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what would you choose, the shore or the sea? If this story finds you in a quiet place, gently tap like and subscribe to keep the voyage alive. Your support helps these stories drift a little farther into the world. Now dim your screen, let the air grow still, and listen as the tide carries us back to where it all began. The night hums softly over the Atlantic. A sheet of dark water stretches endlessly, quiet and immense, like a thought that never ends. Waves sigh against a rocky shore, and the wind carries the faint scent of salt and pine. This is Portugal, long before anyone calls it an empire. A small strip of land pressed between the mountains and the sea, still finding its place in the wide, restless world. The year is somewhere in the late 14th century. Europe sleeps uneasily. Kingdoms rise and fall like tides. The Black Death has passed, leaving behind silence and empty streets. Empires crumble, and yet, at the edge of the Iberian Peninsula, something stirs. In a small fishing village, men mend their nets under lantern light. They whisper about strange things the sea brings to shore. Driftwood carved with markings no one can read. Feathers from birds that never fly this far. A seed that sprouts green even in salt air. The ocean to them is not just a boundary, it is a voice, and that voice is calling. Portugal, at this time, is barely a century old as a kingdom. Its people are farmers and sailors, craftsmen and wanderers. They live close to the edge, not only of the continent, but of the known world. Beyond the horizon lies a mystery that has frightened and fascinated humans for as long as they have watched the sunset over water. The sea for medieval Europe is both sacred and terrifying. It is where monsters live, where the map ends, where the divine and the forbidden meet. But for the Portuguese, the ocean feels different. It is not a wall, it is a door. Their land is narrow, their soil thin, but their gaze is wide. Every tide pulls at their imagination. Every gull that circles above the cliff seems to whisper that the world is bigger than they've been told. In the court of King Juan I, the air is thick with talk of survival. The Castilians, their neighbours and rivals, are powerful and ambitious. The French and English fight their endless wars. But Portugal, small and defiant, turns its attention elsewhere. A young man listens quietly in these royal halls. His name is Infante Dom Enrique. though history will know him as Prince Henry the Navigator. He is not yet the visionary legend he will become. He is simply curious, drawn not to courtly dances or noble feasts, but to maps, stars, and the distant sound of surf. He walks the docks of Lisbon at dawn, watching fishermen unload their catch, peppering them with questions. What currents pull you south? What winds carry you home? Do you ever see lights at night, far out where no land should be? To many, he is eccentric. To some, a dreamer. But Henry is not dreaming idly. He feels deep within him that Portugal's destiny lies beyond the horizon. The 15th century is dawning, an age of uncertainty and promise. Europe is beginning to stir after centuries of isolation. New instruments of navigation, the astrolabe, the quadrant, and the mysterious compass, are changing how sailors see the sea. Still, no one truly knows what lies beyond Cape Bojador, a wild, storm-torn point on the coast of North Africa. Sailors call it the end of the world. They believe the waters beyond boil under the sun, that monsters wait to devour ships whole, that the very sea itself turns to flame. But Prince Henry is not convinced. He gathers cartographers, astronomers, and shipwrights at a small outpost near Sagres, on Portugal's southern tip, a place where the land seems to lean into the ocean. Here, he builds something new, not just a port, but a dreaming station for exploration. They call it the School of Sagres, though school may not be the right word. It is more a circle of obsession, where men trade stories, sketch new coastlines, and argue about the size of the world. By candlelight, they trace coastlines in sand, drawing routes no one has sailed, correcting the errors of ancient maps. One by one, they begin to send ships beyond fear, slender caravels with tall triangular sails, built to dance with the wind instead of fight it. The first voyages are small and trembling, a few leagues beyond Cape Bojador, then a little farther, then farther still. Every return feels like a miracle. Every discovery, no matter how small, an inlet, a current, a piece of coastline, becomes a revelation. The sailors bring back stories of islands where flowers bloom in impossible colours, of shores where the sand glitters with strange metals, of people whose skin is darker than night and whose songs drift over the waves. Portugal listens, wide-eyed. The world is expanding, and the map of the possible grows with it. The Atlantic, once a fearful void, begins to whisper secrets. In those whispers, Portugal hears opportunity. Ships push farther south along the African coast, not as conquerors, not yet, but as explorers. They barter for ivory, gold dust, and pepper. They mark the positions of rivers and stars. Prince Henry funds expedition after expedition, not because of greed alone, but because he believes the ocean is a path to knowledge, a way to connect the world's scattered edges. Each voyage brings Portugal closer to something vast and irreversible, a realization that the sea does not end, it continues, wrapping the earth in blue. But the ocean gives nothing freely. For every ship that returns, another disappears. Families wait on the cliffs, scanning the horizon for sails that never reappear. Still, the pull of the unknown is stronger than the fear of loss. By mid-century, Portuguese sailors have reached the Azores, the Canary Islands, and the Madeira archipelago, each one a stepping stone across the Atlantic. They plant vines, build stone chapels, and name the winds that circle the islands. They are no longer the edge of Europe. They are becoming its bridge to the world. Lisbon changes too. Once a humble riverside town, it begins to swell with energy. A harbour alive with masts, ropes and voices from every shore. Dock workers unload barrels of sugar and salt. Merchants argue in Portuguese, Arabic and Italian. The air smells of citrus, smoke and wet wood. Somewhere among the chaos, a cartographer sits hunched over a map, drawing the outlines of Africa's coast. His candle flickers, his ink runs low, but his lines reach farther than any before him, stretching toward a promise that glows faintly at the world's edge. Portugal's story is not one of size but of vision. It is a reminder that sometimes the smallest nations dream the biggest dreams. They do not know it yet, but this restless curiosity will carry them across oceans to India, Japan, Brazil, and beyond. It will bring glory and gold, but also conquest and cruelty. It will weave Portugal's fate with that of continents and peoples far from home. But tonight, in this quiet first chapter, there are no empires, no crowns, no slaves or spices. There is only wind, wood and wonder. The empire has not yet begun. Only the sea speaks, and Portugal listens. The sound of the Atlantic deepens. The tide folds upon itself, as if whispering names not yet written. Ceuta, Goa, Macau, Rio de Janeiro. They will come later as echoes of this first trembling step. For now, the night holds still over Sagres. The young prince studies the stars, charting invisible paths across the heavens. The world, it seems, is waiting, and far out at sea, under a sky full of strange constellations, a single Portuguese caravel turns its sails to the wind and vanishes into the dark. The dawn breaks softly over Sagres. Mist drifts like silk between the cliffs, and the horizon glows faintly gold. A narrow line between the sleeping world and everything beyond it. Inside a small stone fortress overlooking the sea, a man sits alone. His robes are plain, his hands calloused, his eyes weary from long nights of thought. Before him lies a map, a fragile skin of parchment covered in inked coastlines that look almost alive. The man is Prince Henry of Portugal, known now by sailors and scholars as O Navegador, the navigator. But in truth, Henry never captained a ship. He never crossed the equator, never rounded the Cape of Good Hope, never set eyes on India. His voyages were of the mind and of imagination. He dreamed in coastlines. Outside, the sea murmurs against the rocks. The sound is constant, hypnotic, a reminder of everything Henry cannot yet see. He closes his eyes, tracing invisible routes with his fingers. One line follows the African coast. Another curves westward toward the uncharted Atlantic. Each route is a promise, a doorway to knowledge, to wealth, to God. Henry is not dreaming for himself. He dreams for Portugal. When he was a boy, the world seemed small. The maps of his tutors ended where the parchment burned to blank space. Terra incognita, the unknown land. The edges of the world were drawn with dragons, serpents, and warnings. Here be monsters. But Henry's mind refused boundaries. He saw those monsters not as threats but as invitations. What if the world were rounder, wider, deeper than the old scholars claimed? What if the sun touched lands unseen, where other kings ruled and other treasures waited? He began to ask questions no one could answer. In 1415, Henry rode with his father, King Juan I, and his brothers across the sea to Ceuta, a North African port held by Muslim merchants. The campaign was brutal, the air thick with dust, arrows, and smoke. But it changed him forever. For the first time, Henry saw the wealth of Africa with his own eyes: spices, silks, ivory, gold. He saw maps drawn by Arab navigators that reached far beyond what Europeans imagined. And he realized that if Portugal could master the sea, it could reach those distant markets, and more. When he returned home, he did not seek glory in battle. He sought knowledge. He settled in Sagres, at the far southern edge of Portugal, where the winds from the Atlantic met the winds from Africa, a crossroads of weather, trade, and fate. There, he built what some called a school, others a dream. Sailors, map-makers, astronomers, mathematicians, all were welcome. They gathered like moths to a flame, trading languages, measurements, and myths. At night, they stood beneath the stars, arguing softly over the shapes of constellations and the distance between one horizon and the next. Some claimed the world ended where the sky met the sea. Others, braver or more foolish, insisted it curved gently onward, unseen, and Henry listened to them all. His ambition was not only exploration. It was order, the divine geometry of creation itself. If one could map the seas, measure the heavens, and trace the routes of the stars, then one could touch the mind of God. He believed navigation was not merely a craft. It was a form of worship. Slowly, Sagres became a living experiment. Henry's shipwrights built a new kind of vessel, the caravel. Unlike the heavy, square-sailed ships of northern Europe, the caravel was light and graceful. Its triangular lateen sails could catch the wind from almost any direction, allowing sailors to tack, to move against the wind rather than be ruled by it. It was a small revolution, built from timber and canvas. The caravel would become the key to the world. Henry sent expeditions south, along the African coast, not to conquer, not yet, but to learn. The early voyages were tentative. Some ships turned back in fear. Others vanished into storms and silence. But each success, each new headland or river, each scrap of coastline added a new thread to the tapestry Henry was weaving. The first great milestone came when Gil Eanes, a humble sailor from Lagos, crossed the dreaded Cape Bojador in 1434, the mythical edge of the world. When he returned, the court held its breath. He had seen no monsters, no sea of fire, only wind, waves, and a desert coastline stretching farther south. The world had just grown larger. That crossing changed everything. Suddenly, fear itself had boundaries, and they could be passed. More ships followed, reaching Rio de Oro, Arguin, and the coasts of Senegal. They traded for gold, pepper, and, ominously, the first enslaved people captured and sold in Europe. The empire Henry dreamed of was still in its infancy, but its contradictions were already visible. Curiosity and conquest, faith and greed, courage and cruelty, all intertwined. In Lisbon, the docks grew crowded with ships returning from the south. The smell of tar and spice filled the air. Merchants grew rich. The church praised Henry's voyages as divine missions, a way to spread Christianity to the edges of the earth. But not everyone saw only holiness in his work. Whispers drifted through the court that the prince's obsession had drained the treasury, that his charts were fantasies, that he had turned his back on worldly affairs. Still, Henry continued. He funded voyage after voyage, sometimes against all advice. He rarely smiled, rarely celebrated, as though the satisfaction lay not in discovery, but in the act of seeking itself. He grew older, quieter, his beard turning silver, his eyes sharp as ever. Every night, he returned to his maps. One evening, a young navigator brought him a shell polished smooth by ocean tides. "It comes from beyond the Senegal," the sailor said. "The people there call it the cowrie. They say it brings fortune." Henry turned the shell in his hand. It gleamed softly under the candlelight, reflecting the lines of his maps. To him, it was more than a trinket. It was proof. Proof that the world was full of beauty, waiting to be found. He placed it on his desk beside a worn compass and a silver cross. As the years passed, the school at Sagres became quieter. The prince withdrew further from Lisbon, content to live among charts and sailors. He watched storms roll in from the Atlantic, listening to their voices like old friends. Sometimes he would stand on the ramparts and stare westward toward the setting sun. He would imagine what might lie beyond. Perhaps islands, perhaps a new continent. He would never know. Henry died in 1460, his body frail, his mind still adrift among imaginary coastlines. When word of his death spread through Lisbon, sailors lowered their flags. Merchants paused at the harbour. The sea itself seemed to fall silent. But his dream did not die. Because of him, Portugal had learned a dangerous and magnificent truth, that the horizon was not an end, only a beginning. In the years that followed, his protégés would continue his work. Diogo Cao, Bartolomeu Dias, Vasco da Gama, names that would echo across centuries, all sailed on routes first drawn in Henry's fragile maps. By the time Dias finally rounded the southern tip of Africa in 1488, the fabled Cape of Good Hope, Henry had been gone nearly 30 years. But his hand was still on the tiller of history. His dream had become a current, one that carried Portugal into every ocean. When we look back at him now, we see not just a prince, but a paradox. A man of faith who unleashed forces he could never fully control. A visionary whose pursuit of knowledge opened paths for trade, art, and science, but also for slavery, war, and empire. He dreamed of maps, and the world bent to those dreams, for better and for worse. The night closes again over Sagres. The fortress stands empty now, the stone weathered by centuries of wind and salt. But if you stand on its cliffs and listen closely, the sea still speaks. You can almost hear the scratching of a quill on parchment, the murmur of sailors naming stars, the heartbeat of a small kingdom dreaming itself into the world. And perhaps, just beneath the waves, the ghost of a caravel passes quietly, sails full, compass steady, following the lines once drawn by a prince who dreamed not of crowns or gold, but of maps. The year is 1486. The sea has grown busier, not with armies, but with questions. In Lisbon, the docks are alive with purpose. Caravels rock gently in the tide, their masts swaying like forest canopies of wood and rope. The scent of pitch and salt fills the air. Sailmakers sing softly as they stitch canvas under the morning light. The age of dreaming is ending. The age of sailing has begun. Prince Henry is gone, but his students, the navigators and apprentices he inspired, now stand at the helm of his vision. They are men who have inherited both his courage and his obsession. Each carries in his mind an invisible line, the curve of Africa's coast, traced not in ink, but in imagination. They know that somewhere to the south, perhaps far beyond their reckoning, the land must end. And if it ends, perhaps it also turns. If one can sail around it, one might reach the fabled lands of the East, India, Cathay, the Spice Islands, without crossing the dangerous heart of the Muslim-controlled Mediterranean. Gold, pepper, silk, and souls for conversion. Everything a king could dream of lies on the other side of that invisible line. And so, the Portuguese prepare to chase the edge of the world. The man chosen to lead the next great voyage is Bartolomeu Dias, a seasoned mariner, quiet and deliberate. He has studied the winds, the stars, the shape of clouds. He knows how storms form, how currents pull, how silence on the water can mean both peace and peril. In the summer of 1487, Dias leaves Lisbon with 3 ships, small caravels, light as birds compared to the great galleons that will come later. Each carries provisions for many months, barrels of salted cod and wine, hard bread, dried beans, and the constant prayer that they will see land again. As the fleet drifts from the mouth of the Tagus River, the people on shore wave slowly, their faces bright and uncertain in the dawn. The ships slide westward, their sails catching the first wind of destiny. The journey south is both beautiful and cruel. The men learn the rhythm of the ocean, its patience, its moods. Some nights, the sea glows faintly with phosphorescent light, each wave sparkling like spilled stars. On other nights, the darkness feels endless, pressing close around the ships. They pass familiar ports, Madeira, the Canary Islands, Cape Verde, and then push onward into latitudes no European has seen. Days blur into one another. The sun burns. The water grows warmer. The air smells faintly of the African continent, earthy and sweet. Then, for weeks, the wind dies. The sails hang limp. The ships drift in silence. Men whisper that they have reached the edge of the world, the place where the ocean swallows time. But Dias stands on the deck each dawn, eyes fixed on the horizon. He knows something the others do not, that the wind is not gone, only hiding. He waits. When it comes with fury. The storm rises like a living thing, sudden, roaring, unstoppable. The waves climb higher than masts. The wind howls through rigging like 1,000 voices. The men scream prayers to God and to the Virgin, clinging to the rails as water crashes over the decks. The ships are thrown apart, swallowed by blackness. For 13 days they drift blind, pushed south and east by the raging wind. No one knows where they are. The sky shows no stars. It is only when the storm finally breaks, when the clouds tear open to reveal pale sunlight, that they see it. A vast cold sea stretching before them. They have passed the southernmost tip of Africa without knowing it. They have done what no one believed possible. Dias turns his ship north and follows the coastline upward, seeking proof of what they have accomplished. The air grows cooler. The water darkens. He lands on a small bay, a curve of sand and stone guarded by cliffs. There, he raises a wooden cross. The sailors kneel, exhausted and awed. When they return home and tell their story, the king asks him the name of this place. Dias calls it the Cape of Storms, for the terror that nearly took their lives. But King João II, understanding the magnitude of what has been achieved, renames it the Cape of Good Hope, because beyond it lies the promise of India and the rest of the world. The return voyage is harsh. Supplies run low, men fall sick. But when Dias finally reaches Lisbon again, his news changes everything. The ocean is no longer a wall. It is a road. The map of the world is opened. The king wastes no time. He sends emissaries across Europe, spreading word that Portugal, small, steadfast Portugal, has reached the Southern Ocean, and he commissions one final voyage to complete the dream, to sail around Africa, all the way to the lands of spice and silk. The man chosen to lead it is Vasco da Gama, a name that will soon echo through history like thunder over the sea. Da Gama is not a prince, not a poet. He is a commander, sharp, pragmatic, and unyielding. Where Dias was cautious, da Gama is resolute. He understands that the ocean respects only those who refuse to fear it. In 1497, he sets sail from Lisbon with 4 ships and a crew of over 150 men. The city gathers to watch them depart, the masts like spires against a morning sky. Priests bless the voyage, soldiers salute, merchants whisper of fortunes beyond imagination. As the fleet disappears into the horizon, no one knows if they will ever return. Months pass. The ships round the Cape of Good Hope, battling storms fiercer than any before. The men suffer from thirst, scurvy, and despair, but da Gama does not turn back. He follows the eastern coast of Africa, stopping at Mozambique, Mombasa, and Malindi, guided by local pilots and Arab navigators, whose knowledge of the Indian Ocean stretches back centuries. There, at Malindi, he meets a man who will change history, a pilot who knows the winds that cross the ocean to India. When the monsoon winds rise, da Gama takes the chance. The sails fill, the ships surge forward. Weeks later, they reach Calicut, on India's Malabar coast. The dream of Prince Henry, the work of Bartolomeu Dias, the patience of a century, all culminate in that single moment. Portugal has found the sea route to Asia. The world shudders. Lisbon erupts in celebration when da Gama returns in 1499. Bells ring, cannons roar, and the air fills with the scent of spice and victory. Gold flows into the royal treasury. Pepper and cinnamon fill the markets. The small kingdom that once clung to the edge of Europe now stands at the centre of the world's first global network. And yet, beneath the triumph, there is something quieter. The same whisper that once stirred in the fishing villages of old Portugal. The voice of the sea, asking what will be done with all this power. The years that follow transform everything. Lisbon becomes a city of sails and strangers, Moors from Africa, merchants from Venice, traders from India and China, priests from Rome, and slaves from lands newly discovered. The streets fill with colour and chaos. The harbour smells of clove, pepper, tar, and ambition. Portugal, once the listener to the ocean, has become its conqueror. But every tide that rises must also recede. The seeds of glory are always planted in the same soil as ruin. For now, though, the world is wide and new, and the Portuguese ships are its first messengers. In the quiet of night, far from the noise of the harbour, a sailor sits by the water and stares at the reflection of stars. He thinks of the voyage, the storms, the strange ports, the endless blue. He cannot name what he feels. Pride, perhaps. Fear. But mostly he feels small, as though he has seen too much of God's world to ever fully belong to it again. He whispers a prayer, not for himself, but for the ships still sailing beyond sight, for those who will follow the wind into darkness and return with the light of discovery. The tide washes over his boots, cold and soft. Somewhere out there, the next journey has already begun. The Portuguese Empire is awakening. Its sails stretch across oceans, its faith and hunger entwined. And though the stars look eternal, the world they shine upon is about to change forever. The sea that once whispered to a small kingdom now speaks to the whole earth. And the world, for better or worse, begins to listen. The sun rises over the river Tagus, turning the water into liquid gold. 1,000 masts shimmer in the dawn, tall, proud, and still. The sound of bells drifts through Lisbon, mingling with gulls' cries and the creak of ropes tightening against the tide. It is the early 1500s. The city has awakened into something astonishing, a dream made solid, a map turned into a living thing. Lisbon is no longer the quiet harbour of fishermen and monks. It has become the heart of a world that seems suddenly, impossibly, infinite. Ships come and go in a rhythm older than any prayer. From the west, they bring the green scent of Brazil, logs of redwood, parrots in cages, and stories of forests that hum with life. From the east, they bring silks and sapphires, pepper and porcelain, spices so fragrant that the very air of Lisbon smells of faraway kingdoms. Each voyage carries risk, but also wonder. And every return feels like the fulfillment of prophecy, as though the ocean itself has decided to make Portugal its messenger. In the royal palace overlooking the Tagus, King Manuel I walks slowly through a hall lined with maps. He runs his fingers along coastlines freshly inked, each one a scar of conquest and courage. The old dream of Prince Henry has become reality. The caravels no longer creep cautiously along the African coast. They cross oceans with confidence, guided by compasses that point toward destiny. Manuel is called O Venturoso, the fortunate one, for fortune has indeed smiled upon him. Under his reign, Portugal reaches India, conquers cities, and builds fortresses that will guard the seas for centuries. The empire is no longer an idea, it is a pulse, a heartbeat that can be felt from Lisbon to Goa, from Mozambique to Malacca, from Brazil to the Moluccas. The first great symbol of this new age rises beside the river, the Torre de Belém, the Tower of Bethlehem. It stands white and intricate, its balconies carved with ropes and shells, its walls decorated with the armillary sphere, the royal emblem of discovery. To those who see it for the first time, it seems both fortress and prayer, a monument to faith and to the sea. From its turrets, cannons point outward, guarding the mouth of the Tagus, but above them are sculpted crosses, reminders that every voyage, every battle is done in the name of God. At least, that is what they believe. The Casa de India, the royal trading house, buzzes like a hive. Here, merchants register cargoes from every corner of the empire: gold from Guinea, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, ivory and slaves from Africa, and above all, pepper, black gold, the treasure that financed cathedrals and crowned kings. In its shadow, fortunes are made overnight. Lisbon's streets fill with nobles in bright silks, their hands glittering with jewels from lands they have never seen. The poor, too, find their way to the harbour, beggars, sailors, wanderers, all drawn by the same whisper, that the ocean can change a life. For a moment, it seems as though Portugal is blessed beyond measure. But blessings, like tides, are never still. Each new ship that leaves Lisbon carries more than goods. It carries the weight of ambition, and ambition always hungers. In India, Portuguese captains demand tribute from local rulers. In Africa, they build forts that become markets for slaves. In the East Indies, they seize control of trade routes that have existed for centuries, reshaping them under the shadow of the cross and the cannon. They call it expansion. Others call it invasion. Yet in Lisbon, few question the cost. The wealth pouring into the kingdom blinds even the wise. At night, in the candle-lit halls of the Jeronimos monastery, monks pray for the souls of those lost at sea. Their voices echo softly against the stone, blending with the faint boom of the waves outside. The monastery itself is a masterpiece of the New Age, its arches twisted into the shape of vines and anchors, its columns carved with coral and stars. Built with spice money, it stands as both memorial and miracle. When Vasco da Gama returns from his second voyage to India, his ships battered but victorious, it is here that he kneels to give thanks. His face is older, his eyes darker. He has seen what lies beyond wonder. The heat of battle, the greed of empire, the suffering that follows in conquest's wake. But for now, Lisbon sees only the glory. The Portuguese call themselves os descobridores, the discoverers. They believe they are fulfilling a divine mission, spreading both commerce and Christianity to the corners of the world. And in a sense they are. Churches rise in India, in Africa, even in the distant islands of Japan. Portuguese words slip into foreign tongues. Maps bloom with new shapes, new names, new borders. But discovery is a strange thing. It always comes at a price. Where one nation finds a new world, another loses the old one it called home. In 1505, Francisco de Almeida is appointed the first Viceroy of India. He sails east with a fleet of warships, their decks bristling with cannons. For the first time, Portugal claims not just ports, but oceans themselves. The Indian Ocean becomes a theatre of thunder. The sound of cannon fire echoes from the coast of Africa to the shores of Malabar. Soon after, Afonso de Albuquerque takes command, a man of iron will and ruthless vision. He captures Goa in 1510, Malacca in 1511, and dreams of controlling the entire spice trade from the Red Sea to China. His soldiers carve the Portuguese cross into stone gates, into coins, into the very geography of empire. For a generation, it seems nothing can stop them. Lisbon grows ever richer. The city hums with languages: Arabic, Gujarati, Swahili, Malay. The Tagus glitters with ships returning home heavy with treasure. Artists paint the ocean as holy light. Poets call Portugal the pilot of the world. And in the midst of it all, one man writes quietly in his study, Luis de Camões, who will later pen Os Lusíadas, the Lusiads, the great Portuguese epic that transforms history into myth. He writes of heroes, of gods, of destiny, of Vasco da Gama steering his ships through divine storms while angels and sea nymphs debate the fate of nations. In his verses, Portugal becomes not a country, but a chosen people, guided by heaven to bring civilization to the seas. It is a story so beautiful, so proud, that no one dares to question its shadow. But the sea, though generous, never forgets. Storms claim ships by the dozen. Entire fleets vanish into silence. Diseases stalk the holds, carried by the same winds that bring wealth. And as the empire expands, cracks begin to form. Tiny fissures, almost invisible beneath the gold. Governors in Goa grow greedy and defiant. Captains in the Indies act as kings in all but name. At home, the nobility begins to bicker, their fortunes tied to faraway waters they barely understand. The empire, like a great ship, creaks under the weight of its own sails. Still, for one radiant moment, the dream holds. If you stood on the cliffs of Belém at sunset, you would see the world itself in motion, ships heading west toward Brazil, east toward India, south toward Africa around Africa, north to Europe. The air would smell of salt and cinnamon. The horizon would glow with sails. Portugal, small, rugged, once overlooked, now commands the oceans. From a single narrow coast, it has reached every continent. It is a miracle of courage, vision, and will. And like all miracles, it carries the seed of its end. The bells of Lisbon toll softly as night falls. The river glows with reflected lanterns, each one a memory of a voyage, each one a prayer for return. In the taverns by the docks, sailors sing of home and heaven, of storms and stars. Their voices fade into the hum of the city, a city that believes it has conquered the world. But the world, patient and wide, is only beginning to turn. The winds that once carried fortune will soon carry challenge. And the empire that rose on faith and ambition will one day face its reckoning. For now, though, in this luminous pause between discovery and destiny, Lisbon shines like a lantern at the edge of the sea, the beating heart of a world reborn. The sea is never truly silent. Even in calm, it whispers, a language of foam and wind, of sighing timbers and slow, rhythmic heartbeats deep beneath the hull. For sailors of the 16th century, that whisper is both prayer and warning. Every voyage begins with the same truth. To sail from Lisbon toward India is to gamble with eternity. And at the heart of that gamble lies one terrible passage, one name that chills even the bravest mariner. The Cape of Storms. It sits at the southern tip of Africa, a place where two great oceans collide, where winds twist into tempests and waves rise high as mountains. Here, the Atlantic meets the Indian Ocean in a chaos of water and wind, so violent it can shatter ships like glass. For every vessel that passes, another disappears into myth. To survive the Cape is to be reborn. To fail is to vanish. The sailors call it O Cabo das Tormentas, the Cape of Torments, the graveyard of kings' ambitions. When Bartolomeu Dias first crossed these waters in 1488, he barely survived. He returned with tales of black storms and monstrous waves that lifted ships into the clouds and dashed them down again. But he also returned with hope. Hope that beyond the fury of the Cape lay calm seas, rich lands, and a path to the east. King João II renamed it O Cabo da Boa Esperança, the Cape of Good Hope, as though words themselves could tame the sea. But the sailors never forgot the truth behind the name. Now, decades later, Portuguese fleets round the Cape regularly, not without fear, but with a grim familiarity. The voyage begins in Lisbon, under the blessing of priests and the applause of crowds. The ships are newly caulked, the sails bright and taut. Families gather by the harbour to wave goodbye, their faces a mixture of pride and dread. When the wind catches, the fleet drifts out along the Tagus, past the Tower of Belém, the white sentinel that guards the gateway to the world. As the coast fades, the sea opens wide, and silence replaces the sound of bells. The days grow long and heavy. Sailors mark time not by calendars, but by rituals, scrubbing decks, mending ropes, praying at sunset. They measure their world by the creak of wood, the smell of tar, the steady swing of the compass. At night, the stars stretch like rivers across the sky. The Southern Cross appears, a new constellation for northern eyes. And with it comes awe and loneliness. The sea changes colour as they move south, from green to indigo, from indigo to black. Weeks pass, the winds strengthen, the temperature drops, and then, one grey dawn, the lookout cries out, "Land!" Far on the horizon, a dark line appears, jagged and immense. It is not a welcoming sight. The Cape. Clouds gather like bruises around the peaks. Rain begins to fall, thin and cold, carried sideways by the wind. The captain orders the sails reefed. Men scramble up the rigging, their fingers numb, their prayers slipping from their lips like the rain from the ropes. The sea begins to roar. It starts as a low thunder, then rises, wave after wave colliding from different directions. The ship heaves, its masts shuddering. Barrels break loose and roll across the deck. Lightning flashes across the sky, white and sharp as broken bone. The horizon vanishes. For 3 days, the fleet battles the storm. Some ships lose their masts, others their rudders. The men lash themselves to the rails to keep from being thrown overboard. They call out to saints, to mothers, to anyone who might be listening. The storm answers with only wind. At the height of it, one ship catches a rogue wave. A wall of water taller than the mast. For a moment, it seems to climb straight up, suspended between sea and sky. Then it crashes downward, vanishing into the foam. When the dawn comes, only pieces of driftwood remain. The captain orders a moment of silence. Then, without a word, they turn the surviving ships eastward, rounding the Cape. Beyond the fury, the ocean changes. The water turns calm, almost eerily so. The winds shift, warmer now, carrying scents of new lands, the spice of Africa, the sweetness of unknown trees. The sailors stare in silence, exhausted but alive. For them, the passage is not just survival, it is transformation. They have crossed a boundary of the world, and perhaps of themselves. Each voyage through the Cape feels like a rebirth, proof that human will can, for a moment, outlast the fury of nature. To the Portuguese, the Cape becomes a symbol of courage, of faith, of the thin line between triumph and tragedy. Every time a ship sails past it, they raise the flag and sing hymns. They believe angels guard those waters now, the spirits of sailors who never returned. But even angels cannot calm all seas. In the years that follow, the Cape continues to take its toll. Ships vanish without trace. Messages in bottles wash up on distant shores. Sometimes, fishermen claim to see a ghostly ship appearing in the fog, sails glowing white, crew silent as mist. They call it the Flying Dutchman, though some whisper it began as a Portuguese tale. A cursed captain who defied God and was condemned to sail forever around the Cape, never reaching port. Whether myth or memory, it becomes part of the ocean's truth, that mastery of the sea always comes with a price. But the Portuguese keep sailing. Each voyage refines the route, adds new knowledge to their maps. They learn the winds, the monsoons, the currents that circle the southern seas. They leave behind markers, stone pillars called padrões, carved with the cross of Christ and the coat of arms of Portugal. Each one stands like a silent witness, claiming the land for king and faith. To those who live there, these stones mean something different. That strangers have come from across the horizon, carrying strange gods and a hunger that will not be sated. In Lisbon, tales of these voyages reach the taverns and churches alike. Priests speak of divine mission. Merchants dream of gold and pepper. Children carve tiny ships from driftwood and set them afloat on the Tagus, imagining adventures of their own. The empire has become a living myth, a bridge between heaven and earth, and the Cape, once feared, becomes the empire's crucible, the place where courage is tested and fate decided. One evening, as the fleet returns home, the sailors see a light on the horizon, the glow of Lisbon. It looks like dawn, though the sun has already set. They weep openly at the sight of it. They have rounded the Cape. They have seen death and returned. In their faces is something both ancient and new. The quiet knowledge that the sea will always take, even as it gives. Years later, when they tell their stories in the taverns, they speak not of glory, but of moments. The flash of lightning on black water, the cry of gulls at dawn, the feel of sunlight after the storm. They speak of the Cape as though it were alive, a living threshold between worlds. And perhaps it is, for every empire must face its Cape of storms, the point beyond which courage becomes hubris, and faith meets consequence. But for now, Portugal stands triumphant. The routes to India are secure, the oceans are mapped, the empire's veins run with spice and silver, and yet, beneath the gold and incense, the sea still murmurs. A warning only the wise can hear. The Cape is never conquered. It only allows passage. It reminds those who sail too far that nature, not empire, decides the limits of the world. As the night falls over the Atlantic, the sound of waves blends with memory, of storms survived, of prayers unanswered, of stars guiding wooden hulls through eternity. The Cape sleeps, waiting for the next ship to test its patience. And across the sea in Lisbon, bells ring softly over the harbour, the same bells that once blessed men as they departed, and now toll gently for those who will never return. The empire sails on, golden and unknowing, toward both destiny and debt. The sea, patient and infinite, waits for its due. The scent comes first. Before the ships appear on the horizon, before the bells of Lisbon begin to ring, the wind carries it, faint, exotic, irresistible, a perfume of pepper and clove, cinnamon and nutmeg, thick enough to taste. It moves through the city like a dream. Children wake to it. Merchants breathe it in like incense. And by the time the first sails are spotted at the mouth of the Tagus, the air itself feels enchanted. The spice fleets have returned. They come from the other side of the world. From Calicut, Goa, Malacca, and the distant islands of the Moluccas, where trees drip with resin that smells of paradise. Their holds are swollen with cargo, sacks of pepper, bundles of cinnamon bark, jars of nutmeg wrapped in silk. Each handful is worth its weight in gold. Men who left Lisbon poor now return as princes. The docks erupt in shouts, laughter, and the clatter of hoists. Longshoremen stagger beneath the weight of treasures that once belonged only to legends. The age of discovery has become the age of spice. For most of human history, spices were a mystery. A pinch of cinnamon could mask the scent of decay. A spoon of pepper could transform a meal. Nutmeg was said to cure plague. Cloves to preserve the body. In cold northern Europe, these gifts from the tropics seemed almost supernatural. Proof that somewhere beyond the horizon, there were lands blessed by the divine. The merchants of Venice and Genoa once controlled that secret, feeding Europe's appetite through the overland routes of Arabia. But now, With Portugal's sea road open, the monopoly is broken. The world's axis has shifted, and Lisbon is its new centre. In the Royal Casa da India, clerks work by lamplight, recording every shipment, every sack, every coin. Ledgers fill with strange names: Pimenta, Canela, Cravo, Noz Moscada. The warehouses glow with colour, ochres, ambers, and deep, rich browns. The scent of the East seeps into the very walls. Outside, the streets teem with traders from every shore: Arab, Gujarati, Swahili, Malay. Their languages blend into a song of barter and wonder. In this new empire, fragrance is currency. The profits are unimaginable. A single voyage can multiply a kingdom's wealth tenfold. Sailors who survive the journey buy houses of stone. Captains are knighted. The crown builds monasteries and palaces of white marble. King Manuel I commissions the Jeronimos Monastery and the Tower of Belém as monuments to the glory of God and to the spices that pay for them. Each carved rope and coral motif in the stone seems to echo the rhythm of the sea, as if the architecture itself remembers the voyage. Lisbon becomes a city of gold and of ghosts. For every ship that returns, another is lost. The routes to India are long, treacherous, and cruel. Months of calm give way to sudden storms. Fever stalks the crew. Thirst becomes a constant companion. But those who survive are heroes. In taverns by the harbour, sailors tell stories of Goa, where the air smells of sandalwood and jasmine; of Malacca, where spices are traded like jewels; of the Moluccas, the islands of fire, where nutmeg trees grow only in the shadow of volcanoes. To the men of Lisbon, these places sound like Eden, but paradise, they learn, always has a keeper and a price. In the east, the Portuguese build forts and trading posts, each one a fragment of Europe planted in foreign soil. Goa becomes the empire's crown jewel, a city of churches and markets, priests and soldiers. Here, traders from every land gather under the red and gold flag of Portugal. Ships from Mozambique bring ivory and gold. Caravels from Malacca bring spices and silks. Priests preach salvation. Merchants weigh profit, and both claim divine purpose. At night, the harbour glows with lanterns reflected in still water, the air thick with music and spice. For a moment, it seems the world has become one vast market, linked by wind and will. But even in this age of prosperity, something begins to shift. The Portuguese arrive as traders, but they stay as rulers. They build fortresses, not only to guard the spice routes, but to control them. They seize ports, demand tribute, and force treaties at Cannon Point. The same ships that carry pepper also carry guns. In Calicut, in Ormuz, in Malacca, the spice trade becomes a battlefield. Fire follows fragrance. And yet the profits are so vast, the hunger so deep, that no one dares to stop. The empire feeds itself on the very thing it consumes. In Lisbon, the people feel only the surface of this transformation. Markets overflow with goods once reserved for royalty. Cinnamon perfumes the kitchens of the wealthy. Pepper dusts every meal. The city's women wear silk from India, pearls from Ceylon, and coral from Mozambique. Sailors' wives light candles for husbands lost to distant monsoons. And all the while, the scent of spice, warm, sweet, intoxicating, fills the air like a memory of paradise. Spice becomes more than trade. It becomes the language of power. Diplomats send boxes of cinnamon as gifts to kings. Priests carry nutmeg to distant missions as symbols of divine abundance. Even poets write of pepper as if it were sunlight captured in a seed. But beneath the perfume lies another truth, one the empire does not sing of. For every fragrant sack unloaded in Lisbon, there are countless unseen hands that harvested it. Men and women who toiled under the sun, in lands far from home, under the watch of soldiers who spoke a language they did not know. The empire's beauty is built on silence, and the scent that fills Lisbon's streets is both sweet and sorrowful. Still, in this moment, the world itself seems transformed by Portugal's reach. The spice routes redraw the map of human imagination. They connect oceans and cultures, faiths and fortunes. They carry not only goods, but stories, the rhythm of drums from Africa, the fragrance of temples from India, the shimmer of Chinese silk. The Portuguese call it O Estado da India, the state of India. But it is more than an empire. It is the first network of globalization, woven not from iron or ink, but from wind and scent. And in the middle of it all, the ships keep coming and going. Each one is a floating world. Sailors at prayer on the deck, priests tending small altars, traders counting coins, captains reading the stars. They sail through monsoon rains and moonlit calms, guided by constellations and faith. The ocean gives them everything, and takes everything in return. Some never make it home. Their names are written in ledgers, their families left to guess at their fates. But others return, their faces burned by sun and salt, their eyes filled with horizons few can imagine. They have seen the world's edges and smelled its heart. As night falls over Lisbon, the warehouses are sealed. The air still hums with spice and song. Lanterns flicker along the docks, and the tide carries whispers of faraway lands. A boy sits by the water, watching the masts sway against the starlight. He breathes deeply, the air thick with cinnamon and dreams. He does not know it yet, but the age he's born into will not last forever. The same winds that brought fortune will one day carry it away. But tonight, under the glow of candles and the perfume of empire, Portugal's world feels eternal. The sea is quiet, the ships at rest, and the city sleeps in the scent of its own glory, a fragrance that will linger long after the sails have turned to ghosts. The bells of Lisbon ring before dawn, their echoes drift across the river, mingling with the soft creak of ships rocking at anchor. Mist curls over the water, glowing faintly in the first light of morning. From the hills, the city stirs awake, slow, graceful, full of dreams. Lisbon, capital of the oceans, the crown of an empire stitched together by tides. From the air above the Tagus, it looks like a living map. Streets winding down the hills like rivers of stone, converging on the glittering harbour below. There are no quiet corners here. Every street hums with voices, sailors calling in Portuguese and Swahili, merchants haggling in Arabic and Gujarati, friars chanting Latin prayers that drift from open chapels. The world's languages all meet here, folded into one melody. In this single city, a person can hear Africa, India, Brazil, and China before breakfast. By mid-morning, the docks are alive. Caravels and carracks crowd the river, their sails furled, their decks heavy with cargo. Barrels roll along the quays, gold dust, ivory tusks, bundles of silk, cages of parrots flashing emerald and red. The air is thick with the perfume of spices, tar and sweat. Drummers from the Congo beat out rhythms while dock workers sing work songs from Alentejo. A monk blesses each ship with a swing of incense. Children run barefoot between the crates, pretending to be explorers. Lisbon is no longer just a city. It is the world in miniature. In the Ribeira Palace, overlooking the river, King Manuel I sits upon a throne of ivory and gilded wood. Behind him hangs a great tapestry depicting the world, a tapestry that grows larger every year. Advisors speak of new forts built along the coasts of Africa, of treaties signed in India, of missionaries landing in Japan. The empire stretches across 6,000 miles of sea, and yet in this single chamber, its fate is decided over breakfast. Outside, cannons fire in salute. Another fleet has returned. The king rises and walks to the balcony. Below, the river shimmers, a forest of masts and banners. He breathes in the scent of cinnamon and sea salt, and for a moment believes his kingdom eternal. Lisbon in these years is a wonder to the world. Travellers from every nation write of its beauty. The marble-paved squares, the fountains carved like seashells, the palaces draped in blue azulejo tiles that catch the light like water. Gold from Guinea lines the churches. The Say Cathedral glows with candlelight, its altars encrusted with jewels carried by caravels from half a planet away. The people too wear the empire's wealth. Nobles in silks from India, soldiers with swords inlaid with silver from Brazil, women with hairpins shaped like tiny ships. Lisbon shines like a chandelier suspended over the sea. But beneath the glitter, another Lisbon lives. In the narrow alleys of the Alfama, laundry hangs from the windows like flags. Fishmongers call out the day's catch. The smell of grilled sardines mixes with incense drifting from nearby chapels. Here live the sailors, the carpenters, the wives who wait. They know that the empire's glory is built on fragile things, wood, rope, and hope. Every tide that brings ships home also carries news of those that never returned. Still they sing, because in Lisbon, even sorrow has rhythm. The Casa de India, the nerve centre of empire, hums with the sound of quills scratching against parchment. Clerks record shipments of cinnamon, pepper, pearls, and porcelain. Mathematicians calculate the profits. Cartographers redraw the world yet again. New coastlines, new islands, new possibilities. In one corner, a young apprentice studies a chart of the Atlantic. His eyes trace the curve of Africa, the long line toward India, the shadowy shape of Brazil. He feels the pull of the sea like gravity. For centuries, Lisbon has sent her sons to the water, and the water always calls for more. At night, the city glows. Lanterns flicker in every window. Music drifts from taverns where sailors toast to survival and sing of the stars they've followed. On the quays, lovers walk by moonlight, their footsteps echoing softly on the stone. Above them, the constellations shimmer, the same ones that once guided Prince Henry's caravels, still burning, still faithful. Lisbon's nights are full of stories. Every street corner has one. A captain who found a kingdom, a priest who crossed the sea for God, a woman who waited 30 years for a ship that never came. They blend into legend, and legend becomes the city's heartbeat. Yet even in the golden glow, there are shadows. The ships that bring fortune also bring people, enslaved men and women from Africa, taken from their homes to labour in Portugal's houses and fields. By 1550, 1 in 10 people in Lisbon is enslaved. In the markets, beside the sacks of pepper and bundles of silk, stand human beings for sale. Their eyes meet the marble saints carved on church doors. the same churches built with the wealth their suffering helped create. Few speak of it. The city prefers the scent of spice to the smell of truth. Still, Lisbon believes itself blessed. From its hills, priests proclaim that God has chosen Portugal to civilize the world. Artists paint angels holding maps. Poets call the sailors apostles of the sea. Even Luis de Camões, who has seen the empire's blood and brilliance firsthand, writes of it as divine. In Os Lusíadas, he describes the gods watching over Vasco da Gama's voyage, rewarding Portugal for its courage and faith. His poem becomes scripture. Lisbon listens and believes, and yet the first tremors of decline begin to stir. Spain eyes Portugal's wealth with envy. The Dutch and the English, learning from Portugal's roots, begin sending their own fleets eastward. The monopoly on spice, once so absolute, starts to fray. Even the sea seems to grow more dangerous, as if warning that the age of miracles cannot last forever. Still, the caravels keep sailing. Still, the gold keeps flowing. Still, Lisbon dances by candlelight, unaware that the tide beneath its feet is beginning to shift. In a quiet corner of the harbour, an old sailor sits alone, mending a net. He has crossed the Cape of Storms more times than he can count. His hands are scarred, his eyes clouded, his voice rough with salt and memory. When a boy asks him what he's seen, the old man smiles. "I've seen the edge of the world," he says, "and the edge moves every time we reach it." He looks out at the river, at the ships waiting for the tide, and sighs. "The sea gives," he says softly, "and then it takes. Always." The bells ring again, signalling high tide. The ropes creak, the sails unfurl, and another fleet begins its long journey east. From the terraces above, Lisbon watches, shimmering like a star reflected on water. It has become the pulse of the planet. Every current, every trade, every dream passing through its hands. But in the rhythm of that heartbeat, if one listens closely, there is a faint echo, the sound of exhaustion, of something too vast to hold. When night finally returns, the city sleeps in its golden glow. Candles flicker in chapel windows. The river sighs softly against the docks. And above it all, the stars wheel silently, as they have since the beginning. The same stars that once guided a fisherman's son from Sagres. The same stars that will one day watch the empire fade. For now, Lisbon remains eternal, luminous, fragrant, alive. The capital of oceans. The dream of a small kingdom that dared to listen to the sea. The Atlantic glitters under a merciless sun. Far from Lisbon's marble palaces, another Portugal is being built. One of fields and fire, of sweetness and pain. If you could hover above the ocean in the middle of the 16th century, you would see it clearly. A slow, constant current of ships moving west. Their sails are full, their holds heavy, their destination green and endless. Brazil, a land newly claimed, half imagined in Europe as paradise. A land that will soon become the empire's heartbeat and its burden. When the first Portuguese settlers arrive, they find forests so dense that sunlight barely reaches the ground. The air smells of fruit, resin, and rain. Parrots streak through the canopy in flashes of colour. They call it Terra de Santa Cruz, the land of the Holy Cross. But soon another name takes hold, Brazil, for the redwood trees whose dye burns crimson in the sun. Timber and faith may have brought them here, but another discovery will keep them here. Sugar, In the beginning, it seems innocent enough. A crop, a promise of profit. The settlers carve small clearings from the jungle, plant the first cuttings, and watch them grow tall and green. When the cane ripens, they crush it in wooden mills, boil the juice until it thickens into golden crystals, and taste wealth on their tongues. Sugar is sweet, but its sweetness is deceptive. The mills are hungry things. They devour wood, water, and human lives. At first, the Portuguese rely on the labour of the indigenous peoples they encounter. They trade beads and mirrors, then demand service, then take by force. But the diseases that arrive with the Europeans, invisible, unstoppable, destroy entire villages. Within a generation, the native populations along the coast have collapsed. The colonists look to the sea for replacements, and across the Atlantic they find them. The first enslaved Africans arrive in Brazil in the 1530s. They come from Angola, Congo, and the Bight of Benin. People of different tongues, beliefs, and kingdoms, now bound together by iron. The voyage is a horror without measure. Weeks in darkness, chained in the hold, the air thick with heat and despair. Those who survive step ashore to a world of green abundance that will never belong to them. They are sold beside sacks of sugar, their worth calculated by age and strength. The plantation system is born. Each engenho, the sugar mill, becomes a world unto itself. A great house for the owner, a chapel for the priests, rows of huts for the enslaved. Day begins before dawn with the cry of the overseer's whip, and ends long after dusk, the fields lit by torches as the cane is cut and hauled to the mill. The rollers crush the stalks with slow, grinding rhythm. The juice flows into iron vats, bubbling and spitting sparks. The smell of boiling syrup fills the air, sweet, cloying, inescapable. It mingles with sweat, smoke, and the low hum of exhaustion. From Europe, the sugar flows outward like white gold. From Africa, the captives flow inward like shadows. Between them lies the Atlantic, a liquid corridor of trade and suffering. The Portuguese call it o comércio, the commerce. Historians will later call it the Atlantic slave trade. By 1600, tens of thousands of people have been carried across the ocean. By 1700, that number will rise into the millions. The empire's sweetness depends upon it. In Lisbon, few speak of the ships that never arrive, the bodies that vanish into the sea. They taste the sugar and call it progress. The church blesses the plantations. Priests preach that labour in the New World can lead the enslaved to salvation. Merchants record profits, not names. And yet, even in the heart of the system, there are cracks of resistance. Tiny acts of humanity that survive like wildflowers in ash. In the darkness of the huts, songs rise, soft at first, then strong. Rhythms carried from Africa blend with new melodies, born of pain and endurance. The words are prayers, memories, defiance. By day, some flee into the forest, forming quilombos, hidden communities of freedom. The most famous, Palmares, grows into a kingdom of fugitives, defended by courage and jungle alike. Its leader, Zumbi, becomes a legend, a symbol of the world that refuses to die. Back in Europe, sugar reshapes life itself. In the salons of Paris and the courts of London, cups of tea and coffee sweetened with Brazilian sugar become symbols of refinement. In Portugal, candied fruits decorate royal banquets. Recipes whisper of far-off lands. the taste of empire enters every household, dissolving the distance between colony and capital with each spoonful. Few stop to wonder whose hands have made it possible. The wealth of Brazil transforms Lisbon yet again. New churches rise, gilded with gold, mined in the Americas. Merchants grow fat, the crown grows stronger. The pattern repeats: discovery, profit, silence. But the empire's conscience begins to stir in fragments. Some priests write sermons against cruelty. Some captains refuse to sail slave ships again. A few freed men gain property and status, forming small brotherhoods within the city. Black confraternities that celebrate faith and remembrance. The moral tide is slow, but it moves. In Brazil, the land itself seems to watch. Rain falls heavy on the cane fields, washing the soil into red mud. Birds wheel overhead. The forests whisper with every wind. For centuries they will remember every tree ring, every river bend, the sound of the mills, the cries of those who worked them, the songs that rose despite everything. The empire will call it progress. The land will call it grief. By the 1700s, Brazil has become Portugal's richest colony. Sugar flows like silver once did from Spain's mines. The ships that leave Bahia and Pernambuco return to Lisbon heavy with sweetness and sorrow. The cycle seems endless, but nothing built on suffering lasts forever. Rebellions flicker across the plantations. The enslaved rise again and again, demanding the one thing the empire cannot trade: freedom. The echoes of those uprisings travel on the wind, across the Atlantic, back to Lisbon itself. Somewhere in the royal court, someone finally begins to listen. Still, the trade continues, sustained by greed and habit. The same ships that carried explorers now carry captives. The same sea that once whispered of discovery now murmurs of despair. The sailors say that on still nights they can hear voices beneath the waves, songs that travel with the current, impossible to silence. Perhaps the ocean remembers everything. By the time the 18th century dawns, sugar has changed the world. It has sweetened palaces, shaped economies, fueled revolutions, and scarred continents. And in its crystalline beauty lies the story of empire itself, how something dazzling can also destroy. In Lisbon, an old merchant closes his shop for the night. On his counter sits a small bowl of sugar, glowing softly in the lamplight. He stirs it into his tea, watching the crystals vanish one by one. For a moment, he tastes only sweetness. Then faintly, salt, as if the sea itself were still inside. Outside, the bells of the harbour ring. Another ship is leaving for Brazil, its sails catching the wind that has carried Portugal's fortunes for centuries. The moon rises over the Tagus. The city sleeps, dreaming of sweetness, blind to the storm that brews in its own heart. Far across the Atlantic, in the endless fields of cane, the songs continue, low, steady, defiant, echoing through the night, carried by the same wind that fills the ship's sails. The empire's harvest glitters under the stars, but the world is beginning to change. And soon, the sweetness will no longer hide the taste of sorrow. Night falls over the Atlantic, and 1,000 small lights drift across the dark, the lanterns of ships at sea. Each one bears the same emblem on its sails, a red cross painted bold against white canvas. It glows faintly in the starlight, a promise, a warning, a prayer. For more than a century, that cross has led Portugal's sailors into every corner of the world. It is both shield and compass, the sign of divine mission. carried by men who believe they sail not only for gold, but for God. This is how Portugal understands itself, as the chosen hand of heaven spreading faith across the oceans. But belief, like the sea, has many tides. The story begins long before the empire, in the shadow of the Reconquista. For 7 centuries, the Iberian Peninsula had been a battlefield of faiths. Muslim, Christian, and Jew lived, fought, and traded side by side, their histories tangled like roots in the same soil. By the time Portugal emerged as an independent kingdom, religion was its foundation stone, a banner under which unity and conquest became indistinguishable. To be Portuguese was to be Christian, and to sail under Portugal's flag was to serve both King and Christ. In Lisbon's churches, priests preached that the oceans themselves had been given by God, that every island discovered, every soul baptized, was part of a divine plan. The world, they said, was unfinished. It waited to be revealed, named, and redeemed. And so the explorers carried not only maps and weapons, but altars and bells. Every new landfall began with a prayer. Every fort was blessed with holy water. Every treaty signed in the shadow of a cross. In the beginning, this faith seemed pure. When Vasco da Gama reached India, his men built a small chapel from the timbers of their ship. They knelt in gratitude, believing themselves witnesses to a miracle. But miracles, once politicized, become tools. The cross soon marched beside the cannon. Conversion followed conquest. The faith that once comforted the weak began to serve the strong. In Goa, missionaries built cathedrals of dazzling white stone, rising from the red earth. They filled them with statues of saints carried from Lisbon, draped in silk and gold. In Brazil, Jesuits raised missions deep in the jungle, teaching prayers in the languages of the Tupi and Guarani. They believed they were saving souls, and sometimes they did, protecting indigenous communities from the worst cruelties of colonists. But in other places, faith arrived as fire. Those who refused baptism faced exile or worse. Altars were built where temples once stood. Old gods were renamed, forbidden, forgotten, or hidden inside the new ones. Yet even in domination, the faith was changed. In Africa, in India, in Brazil, the cross met drumming and dance, incense and ancestor. The rituals blended, reshaping each other like rivers joining at the sea. In the hidden corners of the empire, new kinds of Christianity were born, fierce, syncretic, alive. Saints with dark skin, Madonnas dressed in tropical flowers, hymns sung to the rhythm of the earth. What Portugal brought to the world returned transformed. At home, the kingdom basked in its holiness. Lisbon's skyline bristled with steeples and bells. Every voyage began with a mass at dawn. Every return was greeted by processions through streets strewn with petals. The church stood beside the crown as partner and conscience, blessing expansion, absolving violence, sanctifying profit. But faith, when chained to power, becomes something dangerous. In 1536, the Inquisition arrived in Portugal. Imported from Spain, it came dressed in robes of black velvet and authority. Its mission was purity, to guard the kingdom from heresy, doubt, and difference. At first, it hunted Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of practicing their old faith in secret, the new Christians. Then it turned on philosophers, poets, anyone who questioned too loudly. The same empire that reached across the world to baptize strangers now turned inward, policing the souls of its own. Lisbon's plazas echoed with the crackle of fire. Public trials, called autos da fe, became grim spectacles of devotion. Crowds prayed as flames rose. It was said that faith shone brightest against the darkness of sin. But in those years, it was hard to tell which was which. Still, beyond fear and corruption, there were true believers, men and women who carried compassion like a candle in the wind. The Jesuits, in particular, walked the fine line between faith and empire. They built schools, taught science, and studied languages across Asia and the Americas. They recorded what they saw, describing the customs of Japan, the astronomy of China, the philosophy of India. They were both evangelists and scholars, fascinated by the world they were meant to convert. Sometimes they found holiness in unexpected places, in the discipline of samurai, in the meditation of monks, in the kindness of strangers. Some even dared to write that God might speak in every language, not just Latin. For that, they would earn suspicion from both church and crown. In the colony of Brazil, the Jesuits built missions that stood halfway between heaven and earth. They tried to shield indigenous people from enslavement, teaching them to read, farm, and pray. But the colonists saw only labor lost. The Jesuits became both saints and enemies, protectors of souls and obstacles to profit. By the 18th century, the Portuguese crown expelled them from its territories, accusing them of power and pride. The empire that had been born under the cross now turned against its own priests. Yet the faith never vanished. It seeped into the fabric of every land it touched. In Goa, church bells still ring at sunset. In Angola, the cross still gleams atop red clay chapels. In Brazil, the great festivals of saints dance to African drums and indigenous chants. What began as conquest has become culture, flawed, fused, and eternal. In Lisbon today, you can still see it in stone. The cloisters of the Jeronimos monastery glow with carvings of ropes and coral, angels and sea creatures, faith and voyage entwined forever. Each archway whispers a story of ships blessed, of sailors lost, of a world claimed in God's name. And yet, if you walk there at dusk, when the tourists are gone and the bells fall silent, the place feels less like triumph and more like memory. You can almost hear the ocean outside, restless, endless, forgiving nothing. The empire believed that faith would bind the world together. In a way it did, but not as they expected. The cross they carried became a mirror, reflecting both their devotion and their violence. And in that reflection, we can still see the contradiction that defines humanity itself. Our longing for salvation and our capacity for harm. The night settles over the Tagus again. The ships of old are long gone, their lanterns replaced by city lights. But if you look closely, the water still glimmers red, like a memory of the painted crosses that once led men into the unknown. Faith built the empire. Fire tested it. And through both, the human spirit, fragile, fallible, still searching, kept sailing on. The wind over the Tagus feels different now. It carries the same salt, the same rhythm of tide and bell, but there is something else inside it, a tremor, a whisper of approaching change. For a century, Portugal has ruled the sea like a dream made flesh. Its caravels have stitched the edges of the world together. Its flag has fluttered from Africa to Japan. But the horizon never stays empty for long. New sails are rising. The first are familiar, the banners of Castile and Aragon, the twin kingdoms that will soon call themselves Spain. For decades, Spain and Portugal have been brothers and rivals. Two spears pointed toward the same sunrise. Together, they drove the last Muslim kingdoms from Iberia. Together, they reached for the riches of the sea. But brothers who share a boundary rarely share peace. When Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, reaches the Americas in 1492, the world itself seems to tilt. Suddenly, Portugal's discoveries along the African route are no longer unique. Spain claims a Western Ocean of its own, a new world glittering with promise. The two empires turn to the Pope for arbitration. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas is signed, a line drawn across the Atlantic, an invisible meridian dividing the earth between two crowns. Everything east of the line belongs to Portugal. Everything west belongs to Spain. It is meant to bring peace, but it also plants the seed of every future quarrel. For on maps, lines are clean. On water, they are not. No one truly knows where the line falls or how wide the world really is. But somewhere on the far side of that ink stroke lies a vast green shore, Brazil, and by fortune or fate, it will fall just inside Portugal's share. The rivalry is sealed in parchment and prophecy. For a time, the two empires grow side by side, Spain in the Americas, Portugal in Africa and Asia. Their galleons pass each other like wary ghosts on the high seas. But destiny has a habit of crossing borders. When Portugal's royal line falters, history bends. The year is 1580. King Sebastian I, young and restless, marches his army into Morocco to wage a holy war. He dreams of crusade and glory, of reviving the age of heroes. Instead, he vanishes in the dunes of Alcácer Quibir, swallowed by sand and legend. His body is never found. The people refuse to believe he is dead. They call him O Encoberto, the Hidden One, and whisper that one day he will return to save Portugal. But in the silence that follows, Spain moves swiftly. Philip II of Spain, nephew to the dead king, claims the Portuguese crown. The two empires fuse under one monarch, their flags entwined. Lisbon becomes a jewel in a Spanish diadem, rich and uneasy. To the world, it seems a union of giants, an empire on which the sun never sets. But to the Portuguese, it feels like captivity. Spanish officials govern their ports. Spanish soldiers garrison their forts. The profits of the Indies flow not to Lisbon, but to Madrid. And the enemies of Spain become, by extension, the enemies of Portugal. The most dangerous of those enemies sail under a new banner, the Dutch Republic. Once part of Spain's own dominions, the Netherlands has risen in rebellion, a small, determined nation fighting for independence and trade. Its merchants are bold, its sailors relentless. Denied access to Lisbon's spice markets, the Dutch build ships of their own and set out to find the eastern routes themselves. They do not pray before sailing. They calculate. They measure the world in wind and profit. Where Portuguese caravels once sailed alone, now heavier, faster Dutch vessels follow in their wake. At first, the Portuguese dismiss them, upstarts, interlopers. But the Dutch learn quickly. They copy maps, hire pilots, and in 1602 found the Dutch East India Company, a weapon of commerce sharper than any blade. Its charter grants it the right to trade, to conquer, even to wage war, a nation reborn as a corporation. The seas that once belonged to Portugal now swarm with rivals. From the Cape of Good Hope to the Straits of Malacca, battles erupt. Dutch cannons thunder against Portuguese fortresses. In 1605, the great spice port of Ambon falls. By 1641, Malacca, once the empire's brightest eastern jewel, follows. The Portuguese cling to Goa, to Macau, to fragments of what was. But the balance has shifted. The world has learned Portugal's roots and no longer needs its permission. The secret of the sea cannot be kept. Back home, Lisbon feels the tremor. The docks are quieter. Ships return battered, fewer in number. Merchants grumble of lost cargoes and empty ledgers. The city still smells of cinnamon and wine, but beneath it lingers smoke. The Spanish crown, entangled in endless wars across Europe, drains Portugal's coffers and men. Every galleon built for Spain is another loss to Lisbon's dream. And yet, amid decline, a strange resilience grows. Portuguese captains fight on with desperate courage, defending their forts with dwindling crews. Missionaries stay in distant lands, long after supplies stop coming, teaching, translating, baptizing in the ruins. The empire refuses to die quietly. In the taverns of Alfama, old sailors tell stories of Dom Sebastião returning on a white horse to free the nation. Hope becomes a religion of its own. That hope ignites in 1640. On the 1st of December, as snow falls lightly over Lisbon, a group of Portuguese nobles storms the royal palace. The Spanish governor is arrested. The people pour into the streets. The Restoration War has begun. Portugal declares independence once more. Within days, a new king is crowned, João IV of the House of Braganza, and the bells of Lisbon ring with a joy not heard in 60 years. Across the oceans, Portuguese captains raise toasts in secret, painting over the Spanish arms on their sails. Freedom returns, but the empire they reclaim is no longer the same. While Portugal fought for its soul, the world had moved on. Spain's Americas gleam with silver. The Dutch command the East Indies. The English and the French build their own colonial fleets. Portugal, once the teacher of navigation, is now the elder, respected, imitated, overtaken. Still, the nation endures, bound to the sea by habit and faith. Even a faded empire can shine when the sun hits it just right. In Goa, in Mozambique, in Brazil, the news of Portugal's freedom spreads slowly, carried by sails and rumour. Some cheer, some shrug. The empire's subjects have learned that the colour of a flag matters less than the distance between rulers and ruled. But for Lisbon, the restoration is rebirth. The city breathes again, poorer but prouder. Poets write of resurrection, of destiny reclaimed. Priests proclaim that God has forgiven Portugal for its pride. The bells toll, and the river glows as it once did. Though fewer ships now leave its harbour, yet beyond the horizon, new powers gather like weather. The Atlantic has become a crowded sea. No nation sails alone anymore. The Portuguese, who once taught the world how to navigate, must now learn how to survive. Their empire will continue. In Brazil's plantations, in Angola's ports, in the lingering outposts of Asia. But its age of wonder is over. The cross still flutters on the sails, but the wind has changed. Night settles over Lisbon once more. The city sleeps under its golden tiles, dreaming of the time when its name was whispered with awe. The Tagus sighs against the docks, the same sound as always, the ocean breathing, patient, eternal. Empires come and go, it seems to say, only the tide endures. The Atlantic rolls beneath a pale moon. For centuries it has been the empire's highway, a ribbon of wind and salt connecting continents. But now, in the fading years of the 17th century, The current itself seems to have changed direction. Where once everything flowed toward Portugal, now the tide begins to pull away. Across the ocean, the forests of Brazil breathe in silence, green, endless, alive. Parrots flash like sparks through the canopy. Rivers as wide as seas carry the scent of rain and fruit to the coast. The air hums with the slow rhythm of a land too vast to be ruled by any crown. This is the world that Portugal calls its own. But soon, it will no longer feel like a colony. It will feel like destiny. For a long time, Brazil was a quiet frontier, a place of timber, sugar, and exile. The Portuguese crown had looked eastward for its fortune, toward India and the spices of the Orient. Brazil was distant, secondary, a green blur at the edge of the map. But the world's wealth has changed. The routes to Asia are now crowded with Dutch and English ships. The pepper trade no longer glitters as it once did. And so, slowly, the gaze of Portugal turns west. Sugar still flows from the plantations, the same fields that echo with songs of pain and endurance. But deeper inland, another treasure waits beneath the soil: gold. In the early 1700s, miners in the region of Minas Gerais strike veins so rich that rivers run yellow with dust. News spreads like fire. Within years, thousands of settlers flood into the interior, carving towns into the hillsides, their streets lined with churches built from stone and hope. The names of those towns still shimmer with promise: Ouro Preto, Sabará, Diamantina, cities born of fever and faith. The dream that once lived in Lisbon's harbour now beats in Brazil's mountains. Ships begin to sail in the opposite direction. Not from Portugal to Brazil, but from Brazil to Portugal, heavy with gold, silver and diamonds. Lisbon glows again, but it glows with reflected light. The wealth of the new world flows into the old, gilding churches and palaces, while deepening the shadows beneath them. The empire is breathing through borrowed lungs. In Brazil, the population swells. Enslaved Africans continue to arrive in staggering numbers, their labour driving both the sugar mills of the northeast and the mines of the interior. Free men, indigenous peoples, Africans, and Europeans mingle and merge, creating a culture unlike any other in the empire. The Portuguese language bends and blooms here, flavoured with African rhythm and indigenous breath. The music, the food, the faith, all begin to take on a pulse of their own. A new world is forming, not just in geography, but in identity. Along the coast, the cities grow. Salvador, the first capital, perched above a glittering bay. Recife, where merchants from Africa and Europe trade in sugar and souls. And later, Rio de Janeiro, its harbour cupped between mountains that rise like green cathedrals. The empire's capital may still lie across the ocean, but its heart now beats here, under this sun, under this sky. In Lisbon, the ministers debate how to rule a colony that has become more powerful than its master. They tighten control, imposing new taxes, new laws, new restrictions. But distance is a patient rebel. Messages take months to cross the sea. Orders arrive too late. Authority dissolves in salt and time. In Brazil, local governors act as kings. Churches grow taller, gold leaf thicker, the sermons more confident. Bishops preach of God's glory in Portuguese, but their congregations answer with songs that blend Africa, Europe, and America into one voice. Something is shifting, slow but unstoppable. A sense that the colony no longer needs the empire to dream for it. The mines bring both wonder and ruin. Fortunes are made and lost overnight. Rivers choke with silt. Forests fall to feed the fires of the smelters. Enslaved labourers work until their hands bleed gold dust, praying for deliverance beneath the echo of church bells. Priests baptize nuggets of ore before shipment, blessing the wealth that will sustain Lisbon's marble dreams. But in their sermons, they begin to question, quietly, can faith survive such greed? The same question once whispered on the docks of Belém now haunts the tropics. By mid-century, Brazil has become the cornerstone of Portugal's survival. The Dutch and English have taken the spice trade. The East is slipping away, but the West, vast, fertile, glittering, still belongs to the crown. Brazil's sugar, coffee, and gold keep Portugal afloat, its wealth a golden thread binding two worlds together. Yet beneath the splendour, the empire's structure is beginning to crack. The more Portugal depends on Brazil, the more fragile it becomes. The colony is no longer an appendage, it is a lifeline, and lifelines can pull both ways. The Enlightenment arrives like a warm wind from Europe. Ideas of liberty, equality, and reason carried in the letters of scholars and sailors. In the cities of Brazil, educated sons of merchants begin to read French philosophers by candlelight. They whisper of self-rule, of justice, of a nation not defined by distance. These are dangerous words, but words have always been stronger than borders. They remember how Portugal once rose against Spain. Perhaps one day they will do the same. For now, the empire still stands. Lisbon rebuilds itself with Brazil's gold, rising after the great earthquake of 1755 that reduced it to ash. Churches rise from ruins, their ceilings painted with angels framed in tropical gold. But it is Brazil's wealth that pays for every stone, every bell, every hymn. And so, though the city shines, the light comes from elsewhere, from a land across the sea that Lisbon calls its own, but can no longer contain. By the dawn of the 19th century, the world changes again. Napoleon's armies march into Iberia, and the Portuguese royal family flees, not north, but west, across the ocean to Brazil. It is a moment beyond imagination, a European court boarding ships under the cover of night, their carriages and treasures loaded onto decks, bound for their own colony. When they arrive in Rio de Janeiro in 1808, the city transforms overnight. Palaces rise, streets are paved, the courtly rituals of Lisbon unfold under the tropical sun. For the first time in history, a European capital exists in the New World. Portugal now lives inside Brazil. From that point onward, the truth is clear to anyone who listens to the wind. The centre of the empire has moved. The colony has become the mother. What began as an outpost has become a world unto itself, richer, larger, more alive than the kingdom that founded it. And in that reversal lies the beginning of the end. In 1822, a young prince named Dom Pedro, son of the Portuguese king, stands by the banks of the Ipiranga River near São Paulo. He draws his sword and cries, "Independencia ou morte," independence or death. The shout echoes across mountains and forests, carried by the same wind that once filled the sails from Lisbon. Brazil is free. Portugal, weary and diminished, watches from across the sea. An empire that once spanned the oceans has now lost its greatest jewel, not to conquest, but to maturity. Yet even in loss there is a kind of peace. The child has outgrown the parent. The dream that began with Prince Henry and the sound of waves at Sagres has become something new, something vast, something beyond control. At night, in the hills of Minas Gerais, the old gold towns sleep. The churches gleam faintly under the moon, their towers etched in silence. Somewhere in Lisbon, a church bell answers, delayed by centuries. The ocean between them is still the same, endless, shimmering, patient. The empire's heart has crossed it, and the tide will never turn back. The sea that once glittered with promise now lies heavy and grey. Along its surface drift the ghosts of 1,000 voyages, ships reduced to memory, sails folded forever. For 200 years, the Portuguese crossed the Indian Ocean like pilgrims following a star. Their forts rise on every shore, stone sentinels from Mozambique to Malacca, each crowned with the cross and the royal arms. But the star that guided them is dimming. It begins slowly, almost gently, like the tide turning beneath a still horizon. In Goa, the empire's eastern capital, the bells still ring each morning, and the smell of spice and incense still drifts through narrow streets. The whitewashed churches gleam in the sunlight, their altars crusted with gold. But outside the city walls, jungle creeps closer each year, green reclaiming what stone once declared eternal. Merchants grumble that fewer ships arrive from Lisbon. Priests whisper that the faithful are thinning, and the old families, those whose ancestors came east in search of fortune and salvation, begin to send their sons back across the sea. The world has changed. The Dutch now rule the Spice Islands. The English command India's trade. The French hover in between. Portugal's empire, once a necklace of bright ports, has become a scattering of dim pearls held together by habit and pride. Even the sea seems to favour others. The same monsoon winds that once carried caravels now fill foreign sails. In Malacca, the fortress built by Afonso de Albuquerque still stands, its walls thick but tired. Moss grows between its stones. The Portuguese flag, once fierce above its ramparts, flaps like a memory. Within the market, traders from every corner of Asia bargain in Malay, Chinese, and Arabic. A few old men still speak Portuguese, their words worn smooth by time. They call themselves Cristão, children of two worlds. Their songs mix fado with island rhythm, their prayers half Latin, half Malay. They are what remains of empire after empire forgets itself, a people born of encounter, not conquest. Farther west on the coast of Africa, the fort of Mombasa crumbles under a relentless sun. The air smells of dust and seaweed. Once, Portuguese galleons anchored here, their decks bristling with cannon. Now only dhows glide past, their sails patched and silent. From the battlements, one can still see the ocean turning turquoise at noon, the same colour that lured explorers centuries ago. But the voices that echo through the corridors are Swahili now, not Portuguese. History moves quietly, like sand through fingers. In Macau, however, the story lingers longer. Perched on the edge of China, it becomes a world of its own, part Lisbon, part Canton, a dream balanced between continents. Here, Jesuits map the stars and learn Mandarin. They debate with scholars, build observatories, and write treatises on astronomy for the emperor's court. At night, the city glows with paper lanterns and church candles alike. The bells of St. Paul's echo through the narrow streets, mingling with the faint clang of temple gongs. For a moment, the empire seems alive again, not through conquest, but through curiosity. Yet even this fragile harmony fades. The Chinese rulers tighten their grip, foreign powers arrive with sharper intentions, and Macau becomes a relic surrounded by new ambitions. Back in Goa, storms gather not at sea, but in the soul. The clergy quarrel with governors, merchants cheat the treasury, soldiers drink their pay before battle. The city that once called itself Goa Dorada, Golden Goa, now rusts in the humidity. Its churches remain magnificent, their facades carved with angels and vines, but inside them the pews stand empty. Tropical rain leaks through the roofs. The plaster peels like old parchment. A few devoted priests still walk barefoot through the streets, carrying crucifixes into the jungle, baptizing children whose parents half believe. They do it not for empire or reward, but out of stubborn faith, the same faith that once launched ships into uncharted seas. Lisbon sends orders, but they take half a year to arrive, and longer to matter. Governors come and go, each promising revival. None can stop the slow retreat. The Portuguese no longer command the Indian Ocean. They navigate around the edges of other men's empires, keeping small harbours and older dreams. Even so, they hold fast to fragments Goa, Daman, Diu, Timor, Mozambique, and the fragile jewel of Macau. Pieces of a map fading into sepia. Sometimes ships still arrive from the west, small, weather-beaten vessels carrying letters, priests or exiles. Their captains bring news of Brazil's wealth, of wars in Europe, of kings who scarcely remember these far-off outposts. They unload barrels of wine and linen, load spices and ivory, and sail away again. The sound of their departure is the loneliest music in the world, wood groaning, waves sighing, gulls crying above a harbour that once believed itself immortal. Yet the empire does not vanish all at once. It fades the way light fades at sunset. Slowly, beautifully, almost tenderly. In Mozambique, the forts remain, their cannons pointed toward a sea that no longer fears them. In Goa, the annual processions of saints wind through streets fragrant with jasmine and dust. In Timor, missionaries ring small bells at dawn, calling the faithful in a dozen languages. The faith outlives the flag, the culture outlives the command. Back in Lisbon, the ministers read reports from the east with weary eyes. They no longer speak of glory, they speak of maintenance, of cost. The empire has become an inheritance, too proud to sell, too fragile to keep. Yet even as its borders shrink, its memory expands. In Europe's salons, travellers describe the wonders of Goa and Macau. Artists paint exotic visions of palms and pagodas. Portugal, small again on the map, grows vast in imagination. Nostalgia becomes its last dominion. When the 18th century gives way to the 19th, new storms gather. Revolutions sweep Europe, and the idea of empire itself begins to tremble. Portugal's attention turns westward to Brazil, which soon breaks free entirely. The eastern colonies, half forgotten, linger on as echoes of another age. Their governors rule tiny territories under the shadow of far greater powers. Their citizens speak Portuguese mixed with local tongues, pray to saints with foreign faces, and live between worlds. They are not defeated. They are transformed. By the time the 19th century draws to its close, the empire of the East is a whisper. Goa endures as a Portuguese possession, but India has moved on. Macau survives only because China allows it. Timor clings to isolation, distant even from memory. And yet, each evening, When the sun sinks over those distant coasts, the sea glows gold for a moment, as if remembering. The same light that once guided caravels across the world still touches their ruins. It does not mourn, it simply shines. One could say the empire ended with a treaty or a war or an empty treasury. But in truth, it ended the way all great adventures do, with silence and the faint sound of waves against stone. The men who built it are gone. The faith that fueled it has softened into memory, and the sea, patient as ever, folds their story into its endless rhythm. If you walk today through the streets of Goa or Macau, you can still find fragments of that vanished world. A carved window, a tiled facade, a forgotten chapel facing the sea. The colours have faded, but the scent of salt and prayer lingers. It is not empire anymore. It is heritage, a mosaic of loss and survival, proof that even decline can leave beauty behind. The night closes over the Indian Ocean. Somewhere, a church bell rings once, twice, then stops. Only the wind answers, the empire sleeps, and the sea, forever awake, keeps its watch. The morning of November 1st, 1755 begins like any other. Lisbon wakes to sunlight glittering on the river, to the sound of bells calling the faithful to Mass. It is All Saints' Day, and the air smells of incense and sea salt. In the churches, candles flicker before statues of angels. Fishermen unload their catch at the docks. Children chase gulls across the cobblestones. For a moment, the city seems eternal, a miracle of stone and faith built on the promise of empire. And then, the ground moves. It begins as a tremor, a murmur beneath the feet, like a whisper from the deep. The first crack splits through the marble floor of the Say Cathedral, a sound like the snapping of God's patience. Then comes the roar. The city shakes, walls buckle, the river churns as if alive. Within seconds, Lisbon, proud, golden Lisbon, becomes a storm of falling stone. Witnesses later say the sky turned white with dust. The great churches crumbled as worshippers screamed. Palaces split in half, spilling tapestries and saints' bones into the streets. Those who ran for the river's edge watched in horror as the water retreated, bearing the muddy riverbed and the carcasses of ships. A few minutes later, the sea returned, not as water, but as wrath. A wave taller than the cathedral towers crashed over the quays, sweeping ships and people alike into the city's heart. Fires broke out, spreading fast among wooden roofs. Lisbon burned for days. When it was over, tens of thousands were dead. The royal archives, the records of empire, gone. The libraries, the art, the maps, the memories, ash and silence. The city that had once ruled the oceans now lay in ruins beside them. Across Europe, the catastrophe echoed like a sermon. Voltaire, in distant Paris, asked how a just God could destroy a city so faithful. Philosophers debated whether the quake was divine punishment or natural law. Poets wept, scientists measured, and in Lisbon itself, amid the smoke and despair, one man refused to mourn, because he had no time to. His name was Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, better known as the Marquês de Pombal. When the king asked him what to do, Pombal answered simply, "Bury the dead and feed the living." In that sentence, the Enlightenment reached Portugal. Pombal took control with ruthless efficiency. He organized the cleanup, burned the corpses to prevent plague, and rebuilt the city according to modern principles. Wide avenues, earthquake-resistant buildings, rational design. Where once Lisbon's streets had twisted like a labyrinth of faith, they now ran straight, logical, enlightened. It was a new world rising from the ashes of the old, reason built upon ruin. The Baixa Pombalina, the new downtown, became a symbol of this rebirth. Its grid of squares and streets was unlike anything Europe had seen before, a vision of order born from chaos. Architects tested models for earthquake resistance by marching soldiers around them in unison. The city became a laboratory of the future. But the Enlightenment was never just science and symmetry. It was also defiance. Pombal distrusted the church, blaming the Jesuits for the ignorance that had left Portugal vulnerable. He expelled them from the kingdom and the colonies, seizing their schools and missions. What began as reform became purge. Faith, once the empire's compass, was now an obstacle. The empire's survivors in Asia and America felt the tremor as more than stone. Without Jesuits, the missions in Goa and Brazil faltered. The spiritual web that had once bound the Portuguese world together began to fray. In Lisbon, cathedrals were rebuilt, but their interiors felt emptier, elegant, rational, stripped of mystery. The New Age had no patience for miracles, and yet, beneath the marble and mathematics, Lisbon still mourned. The people spoke of souls trapped under the rubble, of saints who had abandoned their niches, of a city punished for its pride. Sermons rang from temporary altars, warning that reason could not replace reverence. For decades, the debate smouldered. Was the earthquake divine retribution or natural disaster? Was Portugal meant to repent or to rebuild? In truth, it would do both. The rebuilding drew workers from every corner of the kingdom. Carpenters, masons, sailors and exiles all found work shaping the new Lisbon. The rhythm of hammer and chisel replaced the tolling of church bells. The city became its own resurrection. Each new building seemed a promise that Portugal, though small and scarred, could still rise, not as conqueror, but as survivor. Across the sea, in Brazil, gold continued to flow, paying for the reconstruction, brick by brick. Every gilded altar in the new churches gleamed with the sweat of miners from Minas Gerais. Empire, once a source of glory, was now a source of dependence. The colony sustained the motherland, even as the motherland rebuilt herself in its image. By the time the smoke cleared and the last stone was set, Lisbon was no longer the same city. Its face had changed, so had its soul. Gone was the medieval warren of saints and secrets. In its place stood a metropolis of light and logic, Europe's first truly modern capital. Travellers called it the Phoenix City. But a phoenix once reborn never remembers its ashes. In the salons of the new Lisbon, philosophers gathered to discuss Voltaire and Newton. Merchants debated global trade, no longer in the language of divine right, but of economy. Poets wrote not of crusades, but of progress. The age of empire had become the age of enlightenment, yet the memory of the quake lingered, shaping the Portuguese soul, a quiet knowledge that the ground beneath any triumph could always move. In time, Pombal's reforms spread beyond architecture. He modernized education, restructured the army, and reined in the nobility. He imagined a Portugal of reason, freed from superstition and fear. But power, even enlightened, can corrupt. His rule grew absolute, his enemies multiplied. When the king died, Pombal fell with him, disgraced, exiled, a man who had rebuilt a city but lost his place within it. Still, his Lisbon remained. By the late 18th century, the city shone once more. The Baixa's wide boulevards opened onto the river like arms outstretched toward the future. The great Praça do Comércio, the Square of Commerce, gleamed with yellow facades and triumphal arches. Ships once again lined the quays, though fewer bore Portugal's own flag. The empire's power was fading, but its influence lingered, in architecture, in language, in the quiet dignity of survival. In the evenings, when the lamps were lit and the sound of carriages echoed through the new streets, Lisbon seemed almost serene. The scent of roasted chestnuts mingled with sea air. Children played in squares built upon the bones of their ancestors. The earth was calm again for now, but beneath the stone, memory remained, a pulse of warning, that even the most certain world can fall in a single morning. Portugal entered the age of enlightenment older, humbler, and wiser. The sea no longer promised conquest, but reflection. And the people, having seen heaven and hell within the same day, learned to build not just with faith, but with reason. Today, if you walk through Lisbon's Baixa, you can still see it, the geometry of rebirth. The streets run straight to the river, each one an axis of memory and design. The stones beneath your feet were laid by hands that survived fire and tide. And if you pause by the water at dawn, the sunlight on the Tagus looks the same as it did that morning in 1755, bright, indifferent, eternal. The city that once ruled an empire now rules only itself, but perhaps that, at last, is enough. The 19th century dawns beneath an unfamiliar sky. Cannons no longer guard discovery. They echo revolution. The world is changing its mind about kings. And Portugal, small and weathered, stands at the crossroads between memory and modernity. The city of Lisbon wakes to rumours instead of glory. Ships still anchor on the Tagus, but their holds carry news instead of gold. Napoleon has marched into Spain. The royal court has fled across the ocean. And the empire's heart now beats in Brazil. For the first time in history, the mother kingdom kneels before its own colony. In 1807, French troops cross the border. Lisbon trembles. King João VI packs the crown jewels, the royal archives, and the entire court into a waiting fleet. Under the grey dawn, 50 ships slip down the Tagus, sails heavy with rain and fear. Behind them, the city burns. Across the Atlantic, after a voyage that lasts months, the royal convoy reaches Rio de Janeiro. The tropical air smells of oranges and gunpowder. For the people of Brazil, the arrival feels like a dream. Europe itself floating into their harbour. For Portugal, it feels like absence. The palace is empty. The bells ring without answer. In Rio, the court sets about recreating Lisbon in miniature. Streets are paved, opera houses built, royal gardens planted with palms instead of cedars. Documents once stamped Lisboa now bear a new seal. Rio de Janeiro, head of the Portuguese Empire. The world tilts again. Ministers debate under ceiling fans instead of chandeliers. Nobles, sweating in silk, attend mass in chapels filled with parrots and incense. Servants whisper that the king no longer dreams of returning home. For 13 years, the empire's crown rests beneath tropical stars. But empires cannot live in exile forever. Brazil, grown vast and wealthy, no longer sees itself as colony. Its people, planters, soldiers, poets, feel the pulse of self-rule. Across the Americas, revolutions flare like brush fires. In 1820, Portugal's own citizens rise in protest, demanding a constitution and the return of their king. João VI reluctantly sails back to Lisbon, leaving behind his son Dom Pedro as regent. 2 years later, beside the Ipiranga River, that son lifts his sword and shouts the words that will end 4 centuries of empire: Independencia ou morte. Brazil is free. The empire cracks in half, the sound carried across the Atlantic, like thunder fading in distance. Portugal wakes from the dream of greatness like a man startled from sleep. The coffers are empty, the fleets are few. The colonies that remain, in Africa, in Asia, feel suddenly small, distant, and fragile. The royal court returns to a city still bearing the geometry of Pombal's enlightenment, but none of its optimism. The palaces echo with ghosts. Lisbon smells once again of tar and dust instead of spice. King João VI rules a diminished realm, but he rules with patience and irony. He knows the sea better than most. Sometimes it gives, sometimes it takes, and always it moves on. The rest of the century brings only restlessness. Portugal becomes a stage for new ideologies: monarchy, liberalism, republic, restoration, each replacing the other like waves erasing footprints. In 1826, João VI dies. His children, Pedro IV of Portugal and Maria II, inherit a kingdom divided. For decades, civil wars rage, brothers against brothers, ideals against ideals. While Europe industrializes, Portugal argues with its own reflection. The empire that once circled the globe now circles itself. Meanwhile, in Africa, the old outposts begin to stir. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea, and the islands of Cabo Verde and São Tomé remain under the flag, but their importance grows thin. Trade falters, local resistance smoulders. The slave trade, once the dark engine of Portugal's wealth, is finally abolished in 1836. The ships that once carried captives now sail empty or not at all. The empire has lost not only territory, but the logic that sustained it. The world no longer believes in crowns ordained by heaven, nor in nations that claim dominion by discovery. Still, Portugal dreams of relevance. Explorers and cartographers are sent into Africa's interior, tracing rivers, drawing borders that exist only in ink. They speak of a new mission, of science and civilization. But the world sees the effort for what it is: nostalgia disguised as purpose. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, the European powers divide Africa among themselves. Portugal, though ancient in empire, must beg for recognition of its claims. The lines drawn by strangers slice through its maps, leaving only fragments: a coastal Angola, a stretched Mozambique, like torn pages of an old book. Lisbon applauds politely, knowing the applause sounds hollow. The city changes. Gas lamps replace torches. Horse-drawn trams rattle down Pombaline avenues. In cafes, men read newspapers instead of prophecies. The empire is now an argument, not a destiny. Yet pride remains, stubborn and soft. Poets still sing of Prince Henry and Vasco da Gama. Teachers still speak of mission and discovery. In schoolbooks, maps still glow pink with faraway lands that no child expects to see. It is a memory made of paper, beautiful, fragile, fading. At last, even the monarchy itself begins to crumble. In 1908, an assassin's bullet kills King Carlos I and his son in the streets of Lisbon. 2 years later, the monarchy is gone altogether. The First Portuguese Republic is declared amid cheers and gunfire. Flags change, anthems change, But the sea outside the city remains the same, patient, unjudging. The empire limps on under the Republic, its possessions now called overseas provinces. But the illusion grows thin. Each decade peels another layer from the dream. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, the citizens of Lisbon walk to the edge of the Tagus and stare at the water. They can almost see the reflection of the past there, sails glowing in moonlight, the Tower of Belém rising white and proud, the scent of cinnamon carried by wind. They know those days are gone, yet they also know that everything Portugal ever became, its art, its language, its melancholy beauty, was shaped by those centuries of leaving and returning. Empires die, but the stories they tell remain, echoing like waves long after the storm. By the end of the 19th century, Portugal is no longer the navigator of nations. It is a small kingdom of poets and sailors, of saints and scholars, haunted but dignified. Its monarchs are gone, its maps are smaller. But its language, born from the rhythm of the sea, has spread to continents. It is spoken in markets and churches, in deserts and rainforests, in songs that carry across oceans. What once was empire has become communion, not of power, but of words. Lisbon's lights shimmer on the river. The tide flows in and out as it always has. Ships still leave the harbour, but now they carry emigrants instead of explorers. Men and women sailing not for conquest, but for survival. They look back once, at the tower that once blessed the fleets of kings, and whisper quiet prayers, not for discovery, but for return. The empire has fallen, but Portugal endures, smaller, humbler, human. Its crown lies in history, its power in memory, its glory in resilience. And the sea, ever faithful, still waits at its doorstep, whispering of journeys that never truly end. The century begins with the sound of footsteps leaving Lisbon. Not soldiers this time, not explorers, emigrants, fishermen, labourers, dreamers. They board ships for Brazil, for France, for Africa, chasing work and escape. The empire that once drew the world toward Portugal now draws Portugal toward the world. The tide has reversed. Yet in the official maps and speeches, the dream continues. Portugal, the government insists, is still a pluricontinental nation. Not a small corner of Europe, but a mosaic spanning oceans. It is a comforting illusion, drawn in the colour pink across schoolroom globes. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cabo Verde, São Tomé, Goa, Macau, Timor. Echoes of empire turned into evidence of endurance. But the world is changing faster than maps can keep up. In 1910, the monarchy falls. The First Republic rises, chaotic and short-lived. Coups follow like waves. And then, in 1926, a new order takes hold. A slow, careful dictatorship that will last almost half a century. Its architect, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, a professor of economics turned prime minister, rules not by charisma, but by quiet control. He calls his regime the Estado Novo, the new state, a nation of obedience, faith, and discipline. To the outside world, Portugal appears frozen in time, tidy villages, obedient colonies, a portrait of stability. But beneath the calm surface, pressure builds. Salazar believes the empire defines Portugal. Without it, he says, the nation would be a mere province of Europe. So he clings to it with the determination of a man gripping an anchor in a storm. In the mid-20th century, When the world is letting go of empire, Portugal tightens its grip. Goa, in India, declares independence in 1961, and Indian troops march in. Lisbon protests, the world shrugs. It is the first crack in the illusion of eternity. But the greater reckoning is yet to come, not in Asia, but in Africa. The year is 1961 again, but this time the smoke rises from the jungles of Angola. A handful of men with rifles and impossible hope attack colonial posts, shouting for freedom. The response is swift and brutal. Villages burn, thousands die. From that spark, war spreads. First in Angola, then in Guinea-Bissau, then in Mozambique. 3 fronts of fire stretching across a continent. Portugal calls them overseas provinces. The world calls them colonies. Portugal calls it pacification. The world calls it war. To the soldiers, mostly young conscripts, it feels like neither. Just years of mud, fear, and distance. In the barracks of Lisbon, boys barely 20 are sent to fight for lands they have never seen. They sail south through the same waters their ancestors once crossed in glory. But there are no banners now, no songs of discovery, only the smell of diesel and uncertainty. In Africa, they march through endless green, haunted by the hum of insects and the unseen enemy. They write letters home about heat and silence, about friends lost to ambush and fever. For the men and women who fight against them, it is the same heat, the same loss, but carried by hope instead of orders. They fight not for empire or ideology, but for the right to name their own world. The wars drag on for more than a decade. Thousands die on both sides. Portugal's economy collapses under the weight of endless conflict. International pressure mounts. Even its allies turn away. At home, censorship and fatigue tighten around daily life. The people whisper of peace in cafes, careful not to speak too loud. Songs of protest circulate quietly, words hidden in melody. A single red flower will soon do what guns could not. It happens on April 25th, 1974. A spring morning, no speeches, no grand plan. Just the quiet coordination of soldiers who have grown tired of fighting. At 12:20 a.m., a band song, Grandola Vila Morena, plays on Portuguese radio. Its lyrics speak of equality, of fraternity, of love for one's people. It is the signal. Tanks roll into Lisbon, not with fury, but with restraint. Soldiers take positions at intersections, their rifles lowered. The people wake to the sound of engines, step into the streets, and realize it is not invasion. It is liberation. Someone hands a soldier a red carnation. He places it in the barrel of his gun. Others follow. Within hours, the city blooms. By evening, the dictatorship has fallen, not with blood, but with flowers. The news spreads fast. O povo está na rua. The people are in the streets. They sing, they cry, they dance. Church bells ring, the air smells of rain and freedom. For the first time in half a century, Portugal breathes. The revolution brings democracy, but also a reckoning. The colonies, already at war, seize their moment. Within months, independence movements succeed, where decades of conflict had failed. In Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique, and Cabo Verde, new flags rise, colours bright against African skies. For Portugal, it is both relief and heartbreak. Hundreds of thousands of settlers, retornados, flee back across the sea, leaving behind homes, friends, and the only lives they've known. Lisbon's airports overflow with people clutching suitcases and silence. An empire that took 5 centuries to build disappears in less than 2 years. At first, there is grief for the loss, for the confusion, for the sense of purpose that once tied Portugal to the world. But slowly, there is peace. The soldiers return home and plant gardens. The new government writes a constitution promising liberty and equality. The radio that once whispered propaganda now plays love songs and laughter. And in Africa, the nations born from Portugal's shadow begin their own difficult dawns. The connection remains: language, music, memory, threads of gold running through the fabric of independence. By the 1980s, Portugal has turned its face back to the Atlantic, not as master, but as neighbour. It joins the European Union, trades ships for scholarships, empire for art. Its sons and daughters scatter again, but now by choice. Teachers, builders, writers, emigrants. They carry Portuguese to every corner of the world. The empire reborn as language, not rule. The sea, patient as ever, becomes what it was at the beginning, a mirror of possibility. In Lisbon, the Tower of Belém still stands, washed in evening light. Tourists photograph it, unaware that it once marked the edge of everything. The river glows gold. A few small boats drift past. On some nights, an old man can be seen sitting by the quay, his hands folded, his gaze far beyond the horizon. He hums a tune, perhaps a fado, perhaps the song that once signaled a revolution. In his lapel, a single red carnation fades gently with the dusk. What remains of empire is not territory, but connection. Portuguese is now spoken by more than 200 million people. In Angola, Mozambique, Brazil, Cabo Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé, Timor-Leste, and in the neighbourhoods of every continent. A family of nations bound not by conquest, but by conversation. The same language that once carried orders now carries poems and songs. Lisbon, small again, has learned the wisdom of smallness. It has traded command for communion, control for culture, and in that exchange it has found a gentler kind of greatness. The empire's end was not a fall. It was a release. A sigh after centuries of holding breath, a return to the sea's natural rhythm. In the stillness after the revolution, Portugal discovered that survival need not mean victory, that beauty can live even in surrender, that endings, like tides, are beginnings in disguise. The bells ring over the Tagus once more. The air is soft with salt and flowers. The water carries reflections of bridges, not battleships. The sea, which once divided Portugal from its destiny, now binds it to everything. And somewhere, in the quiet between waves, you can still hear the faintest echo, not of conquest, but of a nation finally at peace with the world it once tried to rule. Evening settles over the Atlantic once more. The same ocean that carried Portugal's ships to the ends of the earth now lies calm, blue-grey, and endless. A mirror of history, a memory that moves. The tide folds softly against the shore, whispering the names of places it has touched: Goa, Luanda, Bahia, Macau, Timor, Mozambique. Each wave carries a story home. 500 years have passed since the first sails rose from the Tagus. The empire is gone, its maps redrawn, its flags replaced. Yet its echoes remain everywhere. They live in words, in rhythms, in recipes, in prayers. They live in the colour of skin, in the chords of guitars, in the shared language that binds distant strangers into a single quiet family. Portugal no longer rules the waves, but its voice still drifts upon them. Today, Portuguese is spoken across 4 continents. It ripples through the markets of Luanda, hums in the fado houses of Lisbon, dances in the samba of Rio de Janeiro, and rises with the morning prayers of Timor-Leste. Everywhere it travels, it changes, softens, brightens, absorbs new sounds, like the sea itself adapting to each shore. A Brazilian fisherman and a Mozambican poet may not share a flag, but when they speak, the vowels carry the same salt. The empire's greatest monument is not stone or gold, but speech, a language that learned to travel. In the taverns of Alfama, the old songs are still sung. A woman's voice rises above the clatter of plates and the murmur of the crowd. Slow, aching, beautiful. This is fado, Portugal's music of longing. Its melodies descend from sailors' laments, Moorish chants, African rhythms. It is the sound of leaving and never fully returning. Some say every nation has a word for homesickness. Portugal made it an art. They call it saudade, the ache for what was, what might have been, what is still felt even in absence. It is the empire's true anthem, the longing for distant shores and the knowledge that distance never truly ends. Walk through Lisbon today and you can still feel the ocean's pull. Tram bells echo down cobbled streets lined with blue tiles that shimmer like waves. In the Belém district, the tower still stands, pale stone against silver water, as if waiting for a ship that will never return. Visitors climb its spiral stairs and look out across the Tagus. They see the bridge, the cranes, the ferries. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the creak of ropes, the crack of sails, the prayers of men about to vanish into the horizon. The city has changed, but the light is the same. That soft golden glow that once guided caravels into the unknown. In Africa, the footprints of empire remain, in language, in architecture, in faith. But they belong now to other people, reshaped and reimagined. The churches in Mozambique still ring their bells, but the hymns are sung in local tongues. In Angola, Portuguese mingles with Kimbundu and Umbundu, a chorus of old and new. In Goa, the Baroque facades of cathedrals stand beside Hindu temples, each weathered by the same monsoon rains. In Macau, Chinese lanterns sway beside European balconies, and the scent of incense drifts through streets once patrolled by missionaries. The empire's ruins have become crossroads, not of conquest, but of coexistence. Every legacy carries its light and its shadow. The Portuguese Empire gave the world discovery, language, art, and also enslavement, exploitation, and grief. Its sailors brought faith to new shores and took freedom from others. Its ambition built cities and broke lives. History does not offer forgiveness, only understanding, and perhaps that is enough. In museums and universities, in literature and song, Portugal now studies the world it once tried to own, learning finally not how to rule it, but how to remember it. The stories of the enslaved, the explorers, the priests, the rebels, all are being told again, this time with all their voices. The empire's end has become its beginning as reflection. For all its contradictions, Portugal's story is, and always was, a story about the ocean, about the space between fear and wonder, about curiosity and consequence. The sea taught Portugal everything, how to dream, how to risk, how to lose, how to endure. Even now, the country faces outward. Its fishermen still read the waves like scripture. Its children grow up with stories of caravels and storms. Its artists paint horizons that never end. The sea remains the nation's mirror, vast, mysterious, forgiving. In the 21st century, Portugal stands quiet but sure of itself. A small country with a wide soul. Its empire has dissolved into a community of nations, the Lusophone world, linked by culture instead of chains. Every year, writers and musicians from Angola, Mozambique, Brazil, Cabo Verde, Guinea-Bissau, and Portugal gather to celebrate their shared tongue. They speak of identity, memory, and the sea that connects them. What was once called empire is now called exchange. What was once command is now conversation. For Portugal, the ocean has become internal, a metaphor carried in the heart. Its tides move through the national spirit like breath. You can hear it in Fado, see it in the blue tiles that cover old houses, feel it in the melancholy kindness of its people. It is a sadness that is also serenity, the knowledge that all things pass, that all journeys end, that even loss can be beautiful. Saudade again, the longing that is also belonging. The empire ended, but the voyage never did. At sunset, the Tower of Belém casts a long shadow across the water. Once it was a fortress, a gate to the world. Now, it is a monument to memory. Children play on its steps, tourists pose for photographs, gulls wheel above it in the fading light. The river beneath flows outward, as it always has, carrying reflections of the city, reflections of all that was won and all that was lost. And the sea, patient and endless, whispers back the only truth it has ever known, that every voyage eventually leads home. 5 centuries ago, a small kingdom stood at the edge of Europe and asked a question no one else dared to ask. What lies beyond the horizon? It spent its history trying to answer. In doing so, it changed the world, for better, for worse, and forever. The Portuguese Empire began with a map and ended with a memory. But between those 2 points lies the entire arc of human longing, the desire to know, to reach, to connect. It is the same longing that built caravels, that wrote poems, that still pulls at the heart when we stand before the sea. Now the ocean is quiet. Lisbon glows in the dusk, its hills wrapped in soft light. The air smells of salt and roasted chestnuts. Somewhere, a singer begins a fado, low, tremulous, timeless. The lyrics speak of distance, of hope, of the sea that gives and takes. The notes drift out through an open window and over the river, merging with the tide. And the story of the Portuguese Empire, its triumphs, its tragedies, its transformations, returns at last to where it began. To the sound of waves against stone, to a people listening to a sea that still whispers, there is always more beyond.